Wonderful. Then, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon in the hotel. Oh,
Thank you for joining us live.
Hi.
So, Philippe, we have some live guests from our yard as well as some joining online. So, thank you so much for joining us by Liftoff. Liftoff is a series of dialogue that we started developing with Nadine and Tom Michelberger a couple of weeks ago, seeing how the situation was evolving on a worldwide base and deciding to do our contribution, open the wonderful spaces of the Michelberger Hotel and Restaurant, and engage with some wonderful guests such as you, and to talk about proactive solutions and angles on how we can help building a better now, a better forward as well. So thanks again for joining us, Philippe.
Thank you.
I will say 2 sentences about you, and then we're gonna kickstart with this wonderful conversation. So you are Dean of Professional Studies at the School of the New American Farmstead at Sterling College. What was very interesting from the conversation that we had with you is that you are an author, also a farmer and an educator. So
Father.
you have exactly. Exactly, not the last role, definitely. And so, you really shared this very hands-on experience, and at the same time, you managed to put words and disseminate it through your books that you published, but also the classes that you give. And as you know, Tom and Nadine have been also very active on a farming point of view around Berlin in Fetschau. So there are a lot of aspects that we can see, and a lot of the same conversation that sparkles through Germany and the US.
Mm-hmm.
So. The first question, or like the first aspect that was very interesting for us with Nadine, was that you talked to us about this bizarre contrast of your life, where on one side you've been developing this off-grid farm, where for years you had no electricity even, and on the opposing end, you've been over the past couple of years being very active in developing digital education all over the world. So can you tell us a bit more about this shift of paradigm?
Sure. I don't know if it's a shift of paradigm or a collision of paradigm some days.
At least a big contrast.
It is. And I think, certainly both my wife and I were heavily influenced by the Südtiroler Bergbauern, the mountain farmers there. And, the lifestyle that I first encountered there in 1983, and really starting to see this life that I, had imagined perhaps existed somewhere in the world, from here in the United States, and really seeing the Almkultur, the alm culture that was happening there on the high pastures. And so, a real love and passion for that. And so then when we came to Vermont and didn't have very, very much money, we came to Vermont and bought what I guess is about 10 hectares, 25 acres, and it had no power, no running water, and certainly at that point, no cell reception, no handies at that point. And so we lived for about 8 years with no power and no running water until we started to build a house with solar power at that point. And so, it was living that contrast. And I think taking a lot of the lessons from the South Tyrol that we'd seen there and applying those in the lifestyle that we had here in the early stages. And then, after that, becoming an educator and seeing online education begin to happen, and frankly, not liking it, thinking that it was something that was sort of antithetical to everything that I really believe in. That is the close experience with students that one might have, the idea that you have this rich interpersonal experience and that you maintain that over time. It just seemed to me that online education wasn't going to allow for that. And I also didn't think that the education in the online world would necessarily be very high quality. But gradually I saw, as some of my colleagues began teaching online in graduate programs, that in fact, I was wrong about most of that. I mean, always, I think, for all of us, we really appreciate being able to have the face-to-face time. And yet also, as we're doing now, we also have begun to realize that there are these possibilities for us to reach out and connect, frankly, in some fairly surprising ways. And certainly COVID-19, the coronavirus, that has sort of helped raise that up quite a bit. So, I think one of the things that we're discovering is that online education and distance learning, that in fact it can actually begin to level the playing field, and in some ways make things more democratic when people do have access to the technology. That's really the key piece. So I'm interested in the fact that with online education now, we can reach out to rural areas, to women. Now in graduate programs in the United States, online graduate programs, it's 75% women, which I think speaks to the fact that women are balancing jobs and families, and they couldn't just pull themselves away and go into a university setting directly. And also even in some rural environments, there are possibilities of, for example, maybe instead of educating farmers by bringing them into the cities, maybe in fact what we do is educate them there on the farm and allow them to sort of cross-pollinate these ideas that they're having. So, I think it's all about compromises as we try to figure this world out.
And what is the biggest topics, or what are you actually giving a course in the online mostly?
Mm-hmm. So when I was at Green Mountain College, we had the first online graduate program in sustainable food systems in the United States. And so that was a series of 13 courses where we were looking at everything that was happening on the farm, then looking at the middle of the food system, which so often is ignored and is so critical, as you all know. Really, that's not the sexy part of the system that's there in the middle. And then also trying to understand certifications, for example, bio, organic, Demeter, understanding what happens at grocery stores versus cooperatives versus direct sales to restaurants, to farmers markets. So really trying to span all of those things. And now we're pushing out a new program at Sterling College called EcoGather, which is focused on regenerative communities. And the idea there is actually, in this case, to gift those courses, these 24 courses that we're creating now, gift those to 5 communities around the world. So in India, Bhutan, the UK, Puerto Rico, and also here in Vermont. And then also offer that to other places around the world as well.
Yeah, which is wonderful, and definitely a way to open and broaden the audiences that can have access to such teachings. And talking about, we talked about this kind of semantics, how 25 years ago when you started, we were talking about alternative agriculture. Then we talked about organic agriculture. We are talking about sustainable agriculture now, more and more about regenerative one. Moving beyond semantics, how would you describe a type of food production that participates to restoring the planet instead of damaging it? What's the recipe? What's the formula?
Gosh, well, I guess I would start by saying the formula is probably first and foremost a place specific, that it really matters where you are, and understanding where you are in terms of what's underneath you, what's there in the soil, understanding the ecosystems in which you're working, understanding the culture and the people and the communities within which you're working, and also thinking about the margins of those communities. Who are the people who you may leave behind if you're not careful in thinking about those food systems? So I think starting with place really matters. Starting and thinking more and more, and we're doing a better job of this, and I was reading an article about this morning. We're starting to understand that microbiology is a critical piece of what it is we need to understand. So the microbiology of the soil, we're finally concentrating on that. But then also we're starting to understand the human biome and the microbiota, the microflora that are within our guts. And so if we can start to match these systems and understand them even from the microbiological perspective, then we're not only doing something good for human health and ecological health, but chances are we're also addressing climate issues at the same time. And for me, that really is the beauty. When we can address climate, soil health, plant health, animal health, human health, and take all of those into one consideration, and really understand it from a systems thinking perspective, and that's primo. That's when we've nailed it finally.
And one very big example there was when you were in Malz. And so Lynn talked about this, and you have to share like in detail what was happening there, because it also is not only tackling the topics of like agriculture and how to combine nature and human and health. It is also like touching the organizational structure of society, like democratic. And please share this in detail with us.
Sure. Well, the story of Malz, which some of you may know, in the Vinschgau Valley in the South Tyrol, is just this magical place, and it's the point at which Italy, Switzerland, and Austria come together, and it really is the place in which cultures have come together for quite a long time, but it's in the upper part of the valley there, the upper part of the Vinschgau Valley. And with climate change, the apple farmers who are down further around Bozen and Meran, they've been able to move further and further up in the valley with altitude. And so as they have come in, with the conventional apple industry and brought that forward, started buying land in Malz, some farmers started converting their diversified farms to apples because apples are so profitable. I think farmers there the net profit is between 25,000 and 40,000 euros per hectare. So it's a very, very, high economic return for the farmers. So the people of Malz were essentially facing this onslaught that was coming because of climate change, coming because of monocultures, and the way that the economic system is growing sort of in the favor in too many cases of industrialized agriculture. So the people of Malz or for example, with your organic hotel, the first organic hotel in the South Tyrol was in Malz, the Panorama Hotel. And then the farmers who were the cheesemakers, farmers who were trying to promote also organic apple production, suddenly their farms were being tainted by the pesticides that were moving closer and closer. And so they began to really have these intense conversations, and they had about 24 different conversations where they brought in experts from all over the world, many of them from Germany, to talk about the toxicity of pesticides, so that over a course of about 18 months, people began to understand the issues associated with those pesticides. And so what happened, was that they started to realize that direct democracy was really the way forward for them. And so they had a public referendum in August and September of 2014.
Yeah, the year I was interested.
Yeah, so when they had this public referendum, and the public referendum was, and they were very careful about this, and there was a woman who's a beekeeper there in town, Pia Oswald, and as they were developing this strategy, Pia said, we can't have a negative campaign. We can't call for a ban on pesticides. We need instead to call for a pesticide-free future. So that we have Pestizidfrei Malz. And that really was the key of making all of this work, because what happened with the referendum was 69% of the population voted and 75% voted in favor of a pesticide-free malts, which was just extraordinary. And so then they had to develop the ordinances that were associated with it. It's still in the courts. It's working its way now through the Italian government, and will probably end up in Brussels before it's all over. So it's not been an easy battle, but it's been something that they've been pursuing since 2012.
But how was this piece when you said the experts came into this little town and were talking about the consequences? How was that organized? How was the information given and spread? Obviously, and then in a neutral way and not like filtered in through other interests.
It's a great question, Nadine. And part of what they did was to try to diversify the people that they brought in. So people with a lot of different perspectives. So some were human health experts, some were wildlife biologists, some were toxicologists, some were attorneys, some were policymakers from the EU who came in from Brussels. And not everyone was totally agreed. So, I wouldn't say that the conversation wasn't polarized, but with 24 different public sessions in these conversations, it gave the opportunity to vent a lot of those ideas and concerns. And by the end, most people had come on board. And they did two other things I think that were really critical. One was they got everyone with a PhD in the area or who was a medical doctor, anyone with a doctorate, they invited to sign on to a petition and support so that they knew that they had the scientific community behind them. So dentists, veterinarians, wildlife biologists, medical doctors all signed on. So there was a lot of public trust that was built over time because of those human and environmental health people who weighed in.
Because they were confirming that there were consequences, right? Was that not the case?
Right. In most cases, there was one controversial discussion that was with it wasn't the EU health minister. I believe it was the person responsible for food policy in the EU. And she came in and had somewhat of a different perspective that, pesticides used correctly, could perhaps be okay. And so that was one of the points of controversy that was there. But in the end, those discussions helped, but they couldn't quite get the tipping point. Just in terms of the media and the local politicians. So it was a group of women who ended up really being the provocateurs who finally got the issue to move forward. And they called themselves Holevint. And you can see their website and their Facebook page still. Holevint in dialect just means stop right there. Don't take another step. Watch out. And so it was those women who really were the ones who got the issue out into the public, into the media, and with the politicians. And they just did an amazing job.
Just before you start, Celine, but how is the number of population there, that we just have a scale? If that's a scale of, obviously not Berlin, if it's an Alpendorf, but
right.
What is the population, the ratio of people that they were managing to bring all these people there to discuss their needs?
Right. It's rather, it's rather amazing to me that it actually was, the town is just over 5,000 people. Excuse me, one moment.
Ja, klar.
So just over 5,000 people. And as they were coming forward, it's 11 different villages that comprise Malts. And I'm remembering in square miles, it's 90 square miles is the municipality of Malts. Yeah, so a rather, a small town, which on one hand, people can say that's a small demographic to do this. On the other hand, the fact that a small town of people who weren't necessarily well trained, well versed in advocacy like this, that they themselves found the power within this small town to raise up and do something that really is extraordinary on an international scale. That's not why they started, but it certainly happened.
And what was the biggest learning from this experience? Because you talk about public trust, which I think is something that, for instance, was fascinating at the scale of Malts, in the sense that I understand that experts coming from the outside to the inside was certainly helping to shape the science. I also remember how fascinating it was to see how everybody was touched by this topic on a personal level. So you had everything started with the farmers, like one farmer wanting to build organic produce, but realizing that without the others, the neighbors doing it, they could not. And then you had the parents realizing that the children playing close to the apple orchards actually were getting a lot of poison on them while playing around. And then you had I believe the pharmacist who was doing a bunch of studies, and then realized also that the level of poison that we were getting in our bodies was very harmful. And with this information, then could not hide it any longer, and fell also the responsibility to share it. And then there was later on in the process when some of the farmers managed to shift the production to some organic production, that they could reintegrate old crops that they used to have over there, where I believe this Alps village was very famous for the type of grains that they were growing. And so then with these new grains, the baker of the village could also then starting baking every kind of bread.
You hide a lot of amazing information yet.
To see all of this, diversity of people who were touched on their own level, I think was one of the key recipients, and that if everybody can look into them and see how am I touched by having food produced with pesticide, and then it plays in this case it was playing on one way or the other at their personal level or professional level. What were some of the other learnings, or as you say, sure, it's not the same scale between Malts and Berlin or Malts and the region in Vermont, but what are some of the key learnings and lessons or tools that can be used by any community?
Sure. Well, I think as you both just mentioned, I mean, the fact that we all have a role to play, and it doesn't matter who you are or what your profession is or what your educational level is, you have a role to play. And, just the one example that stands out is Beatrice Ross, who is the hairdresser there. She wasn't really thinking, as she got into this whole battle, really, she wasn't necessarily thinking at first about cosmetics and what was happening even in her hair salon, and the fact that she needed to go organic. And so she became the first organic hairdresser, hairstylist in the South Tyrol. So Beatrice, for me, is a reminder, that anyone can join in, and there are all these realizations that start to take an impact. Another piece certainly is this notion of direct democracy, as I mentioned, that's so important, because I think when we tend to trust the processes that go forward with representative democracy, part of what always happens, it seems, is that the true interest of the public, of the people who are at the grassroots level, that those get diluted as you move forward through representative democracy. So the grassroots activism really matters. And then when we can turn that activism into these public referendums and use, for example, the Swiss model of direct democracy at certain points in time, that's a really critical piece. And I think Johannes, who is the pharmacist in Malts, really reminds us that we need to be thinking about the precautionary principle. And I think there in Germany and the EU, you do a much better job of maintaining the Vorsorgsprinzip, of maintaining the precautionary principle than we do, for example, in the United States, because that is, we need to be better educated. We need to educate more people about the precautionary principle, because it is such a powerful legal tool, I think, in many ways. And then to remember the children. And I think, Malts has done such a wonderful job of that. And in the transition of trying to move toward being an organic town, a Biodorf, part of what they have done is started in the school system with organic food. And they recognize with toxicology, we know the smaller the children, the higher the impact of pesticides. And so the kindergarten is all organic food, and they're working their way up, trying to transition that school system. And so then it becomes not just the food, but it becomes a talking point in the village. And then it also becomes a moment of education that we have to embrace by having these opportunities, and also building up the local economy by supporting what we say we really support, and doing that economically.
What this situation, somehow we can have it as a blueprint a little bit in our region where we have our farm too, because it's already forbidden to use pesticides, but now the biggest farmer there kind of does it in the night when everybody is not looking, and everybody knows and is accepted, because whatever role he plays in other public areas. And somehow it is clear that this should be, as an example, dealt with as they did in Malz. And how do they get the word out? How is that an example that can lead kind of all of us? It's not only around Berlin. I'm sure it's in South Germany, West, everybody, or you can look wherever. So how we get the word out?
Right. No, it's a really critical question, Nadine. And I think I've learned a lot from Vandana Shiva over the past couple of years, and just met her. She was kind enough to write the foreword for the book, A Precautionary Tale. And so then she and I began collaborating. And what Vandana has taught me, and I think has helped express with the people of Malts and others, is that we need to do everything we can at the local level and begin there and focus. But then, we need the power of the networks across our regions, across, for example, throughout the EU. And then we need that to be international. And the more international we create this network while still really valuing the local piece, that gives us all more power. It gives us more political power, more policy power, more opportunity to educate. But then it also provides some economic lift for us all as well. So I think that international network is a really critical piece. And so Vandana began the poison-free food and farming initiative just after this, and invited Uli, who is the mayor of Malts, and myself, and we went to India to celebrate with the people of the Himalayas who are also facing these similar struggles. And so I think the more we can do that, then the more powerful we all become. and when it's an international movement. And certainly, what Pan-EU there in Europe, the Pesticide Action Network, has done an extraordinary job with pesticide-free towns. Celine and I were talking about the mayors in France. I believe it was 120, maybe it got to be 150 mayors in France who came together to push against pesticides. So, over 100 mayors can do much more than just one. So I think that's really our power, is in the collective spirit ultimately.
Yeah, it seems, in that example of France, for instance, what was very interesting was to see how the mayors ban pesticides in every park and green areas of cities. Mm-hmm. And it seems that the political level is ultimately what is important in the case of Mals. Fortunately for them, they had this very I would say out of the box mayor who was politically quite inexperienced, but then figured out with legal advice that he could adapt the law and the regulation of the village so that the result of the referendum could be taken into consideration in regulation. And ultimately, it seems that no matter where we're looking, and when we talk about international networks, they surely have a big influence. But we really then need the conversion on the political level, right? Like to really bring these topics on inside the political areas. Otherwise, this just remains into conflict, which I think what we see often is conflict the right thing, like going, manifesting outside, etc. While which is one tool, but another tool is also really to look at how can we convince politicians who we are voting for or any other level to actually create the change.
Right. And, I think that brings up an interesting point too, Celine, and this is something that I learned from the people with the Pesticide Action Network in the UK, and I think also in the EU, it's been picked up on. And that is, so we have in essence two different kinds of pesticides. We have what are called the cosmetic pesticides, which are used more for the landscaping. They're used in the parks and the public places. And then we have the agricultural pesticides. And the thing that's really interesting that they're doing in the UK, and this is in London, is they're working on the boroughs, so the regional districts of London. Each of those boroughs, they're trying to get to go organic. And their reason for focusing on cosmetic pesticides, those that are used in landscaping and in schoolyards and around city halls and other places, is because they feel like if they can have that impact of the landscape, that people are in the urban environment are dealing with on a daily basis, as people start to understand what's happening in the urban and the suburban environments, then they'll also take more care in thinking about pesticides that are coming from, the places that seem a little bit further away, that is the farms that are outside their scope of everyday life. So I think that's a really interesting strategic approach.
And you mentioned Vandana Shiva and the trip that you did in the Himalaya. We were curious with Nadine to know what has been. So you traveled there, but you've been also very present in Europe. You of course know the situation in the US quite well. What has been your biggest inspirations when it comes to regenerative agriculture?
That women are so critical, and I say this not just because of the two of you, but in every place.
Also.
It's the women who are the change makers and who seem to have the sanity in so many of these conversations. And I've noticed that in also the teaching that I've done, that the majority of people in the programs that I've run have been women. And I think it's because I always say there are three things. There's nature, nurture, and nutrition. And I think women understand that better in many cases than so many of my male counterparts, and perhaps myself, than we do. And so I think women have really been the ones so far who've lifted up so much of this movement and moved it forward. And so that nature, nurture, nutrition piece for me is just really, really critical in advancing this. And so I think as we empower women also as policymakers, I think the change will also come. So I think it's the education of women and women in policy, women in business is really one of the keys to success in all of this. Perhaps I'm biased or seeing it wrong. Folks, welcome to challenge me on that. But that part seems pretty universal in everything that I've seen so far.
No, it is also to do with that. Obviously, there women are always in the context of farming. They were there because you cannot have this is like a natural power duo, like the couple that would run a farm with the kids. Myself, my biggest complaint was to our mother and father that they would of all of our kids just only to have like cheap workers, and they just said, yeah, of course, we work as a family, and so women obviously always were half of it. And not just the ones in the kitchen and taking care of the kids. That was the grandparents. So there's just another cosmos which is natural and also empowers, obviously, today. Do you see, though, the interest now bigger from women in this farming and agriculture, when you also see that a lot of people are studying or going into this topic without having the roots there, as, for example, myself or my sister?
Right. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it depends on which figures you use from around the world, but it still looks like between 60 and 75% of the agricultural production throughout the world is done by smallholder farmers, or some people will say peasant farmers. And I think, and very often in that case, it's also, the women who are doing quite a bit of that work as well. So I think that that's there. And certainly, as we're all becoming more educated about food systems, I think women are playing an increasing role. One of the changes that I think has been very positive that I've seen here in the United States, and I think it's beginning to appear in Europe and other places, as we were talking about semantics, and the discipline, the academic discipline of food systems is something that was non-existent essentially 10 or 15 years ago. And now that we have an academic discipline there that's food systems, and it really embraces everything, not just from farm gate to dinner plate as we talk about it, but also the human biome, then I think we're also beginning to educate ourselves more completely. And so I'm certainly watching more and more women get involved in those kinds of education and advancing their own knowledge, but then also really wanting to find ways to put those things into practice in their home communities. And that's one of the most powerful pieces, I think, of being an educator in this realm right now, is just the empowerment piece and seeing that take hold. So that for me is a huge positive right now and exciting.
And talking about the current challenges of that the globalization of the past decades have brought, one topic that we discussed was the notion of localization or self-sufficiency when it comes to having access to food. Where do you feel is the most important area to look at when we talk about bringing this global topic of food system, food production into the local level?
Right. Perhaps we didn't want this to happen, but I think COVID-19 perhaps has really raised the salience, raised the relevance of that issue in a way that never could have happened before. Suddenly we start to understand that our supply chains are disrupted. Certainly here in the United States, the small farmers and the medium-sized farmers, people now are recognizing that the grocery stores aren't necessarily the place to be trusted, perhaps there's convenience, but when the shelves are empty, then suddenly you start to have a different perspective on how important it is to conserve the local landscape. And it's not just conserving the agricultural land, but it's also trying to find ways to make sure that farming is profitable. Because if we don't have farmers out there and they're not making a decent living, then it doesn't matter that we've conserved all this farmland and we have the possibilities of farming it. So I think trying to find ways to make it economically viable, for our local farmers, and then not just the farmers, but also, and I think we face this worldwide. We spent 2 or 3 generations breaking down the middle of the food system. That is everything that happens once the food leaves the farm and then it hits the storage, processing, distribution, all of those pieces are really critical to making these vibrant local food systems. But I don't think we can stop there either. It's not just about local, in my view, and others may disagree with me here, but it's also about banding together these local food networks and making them regional. Because one of the things that we're dealing with here in the Northeast, we need the local economy, the local food economy, but it also has to be attached to the urban locations that are, 200, 300, 400 kilometers away. So we have to figure out how to make this interface work, because and I think some of this comes from my experience in the South's role. We have the opportunities for farmers to make a living based on local sales. But if you're somewhere like I am, where we only have these small villages of 3,000 and 4,000 people, that's not enough. So agritourism is another way. For example, what I've seen in the South Tyrol, some of that is good and some not as good. Agritourism can also help, but then also these connections. And now we can, with the urban environment, which we can do better and with more transparency. I mean, just using our phones and the ability to actually open up the value chain so that it's transparent. I think that's one of the biggest things we have on our side right now. So that's exciting too.
Yeah, and also the need, because one effect of this period of the last 3 months was that, for example, here in Berlin, obviously it hit very hard all the gastronomy, the restaurants, the hotels like ours, and all, of course, the producers in between who were not able to deliver and to sell their things. And this exchange we had on a weekly base to kind of deal and find ways like how to get out of this was one very big aspect to how do we get the word out again about the value of exactly this production way of farming, of where our food comes from, what do we consume, where in the town, and to also realize what a big of employee we are actually as in a city in Berlin, but
Right.
And the opportunities for farmers in Brandenburg, which is just really in front of our door. There is not the connection there yet that farmers put themselves together, or the restaurants put themselves together to build like a co-op in buying the foods directly and put all these middle structures out. So there is, but there's a hesitation. There is like a slow process where you again have the feeling it is actually something very simple to think of and create on, but it seems to be a longer process, as you also describe. It seems to be on the beginnings of this, bringing this together and formulating what actually should be of value for farmers and consumers within the pricing and everything what comes after, the cooperation actually.
Right. And I think one of the things we have to be cautious of, and that you bring out there, Nadine, is that this isn't simple, and that it is complex, and it takes trust, which requires relationships, which require time. And part of what we're doing now in rebuilding what was taken apart over a period of 2 or 3 generations, we can't fix it in 1 year or 1 season, and farmers have to think several years out. They have to think several cycles out. So it's really complicated. And if that trust based on the relationships isn't there, then I fear we won't get too far. But that is one of the elements of social media and these other things. And with that increased transparency and being able to get the word out, that's one of the really exciting pieces right now. And I think it's why your work and what you're doing is so critical, because if we don't really find ways to bring together this urban and rural interface, then we probably aren't going to get too far. We all need each other in the rural and the urban environment. So I think what you're doing is wonderful and certainly much appreciated. I wish there were more models of what you're doing here in the United States.
We also in the beginning, as you know, and it's just one step after another. And what we definitely see is people need to be informed about everything. This circle of closing, like how is the salad produced, how it is grown, who is needing to take care of this, what's with the water, what's with the soil. This needs to be really talked about. And in the same time that we bring the people from towns, from within the cities, this urban environment with us, and
Exactly.
how we build these bridges.
Yeah, one of the priorities that you had, that we talked about, and then we talked very long about it with Nadine yesterday, is like this like middle system that like we are not necessarily aware of when it comes to the food system, where everybody understands quite easily the concept of farm to fork, but the reality of the majority of the food that we get needs to go through distribution channels.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a topic that so far doesn't encounter a lot of light and a lot of interest, perhaps because this is less appealing than talking about either the very beginning, the production, or the very end, which is the gastronomy. But one topic that Tom and Nadine have been very busy with over the past couple of months is, and what you are actually, you told me, developing at the level of the region of the Northeast, correct, in
Right.
Vermont. which is really rethinking how do we distribute the food. In the US, you were mentioning that there are only 2 networks distributing food, which means there is such a monopoly that it doesn't really allow regions to be, again, self-sufficient and independent. So how can we apply such thinking, or what are the different angles that we need to take into consideration when we want to bring back self-sufficiency to a town, a city, and a region?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that distribution piece is so critical and fascinating to me. And so what some people here in our region are working on is the regenerative food network. And the idea here is that for us in the United States, when you need to get investment capital for transitioning farms into what you want to see, and then also transitioning that middle part of the food system, then there's not always a lot of investment money that's ready to come into the food and the agricultural world. But there is a lot of investment money geared toward energy and transportation. And so what some of the key players, Michael and Kyle Phillip here, have done has they've really helped us understand that, you know, we can always do these tweaks that here in the United States may cost $100,000, $200,000, maybe $1 million in order to move our food system. But to really move it on a scale where it's effective is going to be $5 million, $25 million, $50 million. So how can we bring more money into this mix? So the attempt right now is to focus on regenerative food networks and the distribution system by installing solar systems on farms that actually help the farmers in terms of their own energy production, provide them eventually with some extra capital, and then to utilize a fleet of electric vehicles, electric delivery trucks, to again start to build this interface between the rural economies and the urban economies. So utilizing those EV vehicles, the electric vehicles, in order to do that. And what's interesting here, when you're looking for investment money, you can go out and you can get it from folks who are interested in energy and transportation. So if we can find ways to bring that in by having them invest in electric vehicles, solar charging systems that are based on farms, and also based on the food storage and distribution centers, then we can start to create this different kind of a model that hopefully at some point begins to sort of self-finance, or at least create this circular economy that's focused around food. So that's one of the big efforts that I'm really excited about here right now. It's an experiment. We're all having to find our new ways into this whole new economy, but it's exciting to be on the edge of that.
But that also means it's definitely about bringing to the consumer, not like, for example, having it in one idea that occurred here was to have a big food hall again, actually, where people would have then like this traditional old markets, but also elevate that to a state where it is attractive to, for example, Berliners, and invent actually an old fruit market and vegetable haven, which is actually here.
Right.
So, but you would say it is more towards, it's not about markets, it's rather to bring to people in the distribution system?
Yeah, that's also a really good question, Nadine. And part of what's happened here in Vermont is, Vermont is the first state in the United States to have created a strategic plan for its food system, a 10-year strategic plan. And we're just finishing that up this year. And so now we're beginning to plan for the next 10 years, the next decade. And so we've gotten to, in Vermont, about 11% local purchasing, which in the United States is pretty tremendous. Most states have a hard time getting to even 5%. But the issue is, so we have these wonderful farmers markets like that, and these places that people gather on Saturdays and on Sundays. And there's music, and people come together, they see their neighbors, they meet their farmers. So we've sort of gotten not as far as we can there, but we've gotten a long ways. But now, in order for farmers to have other outlets, other places to sell their food, we need to find ways to get it out beyond the local markets, because it's not quite that we're saturated, but we're close. And so we have to have these other markets open up so that we can scale up. And there's this tension between small scale diversified production, which I really, really like. But we also need some really some good thinkers who are doing mid-scale production. And for them, those urban markets are particularly important. So I think we need all of it. I think that's the real challenge we're facing right now. So it's not easy.
And something else that is very interesting in what you've been working on over the past couple of years is actually this notion of storytelling, both you as a teacher and you as a writer, which we see it here in Berlin and at Michelberger every day, like having the power not only to do, but then to talk about what we've been doing is more than ever crucial.
Right.
Common and mutual inspiration, we see it through conversations, but also through reading and telling stories is very important. So can you tell us more about your experience of like disseminating this knowledge and disseminating these stories, both through your books and through your education programs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I had a moment about 10 years ago, and again, living off the grid here and not having internet and other things, and really not wanting to do Facebook and social media, when I started to realize that that might not get us too far, and watching my students who were participating in some of that, and I started to realize that in some ways we've been losing the story wars. That is, the marketers of the things that that I find fairly disagreeable. Those marketers have become very good storytellers, or at least they figured out ways to sort of permeate the public consciousness in ways that we haven't. Those of us who are pro-bio, organic, and as we're trying to advance our agenda, we have to be at least as effective as they are. And I think part of what struck me was that in the United States right now, the fastest growing trend in agriculture is bio, is organic. So that feels really positive, but it's still only about 5, maybe 6% of the marketplace. So it gives us this opportunity. I mean, maybe it's sad because it's so small. Maybe it's a great opportunity because there's still so far to go. So can we be more effective storytellers and, raise up the stories of the people like in malts, but also try to find ways to tell the stories of the people who are the food processors, who are right in the middle of this, who don't live these glamorous lives, but in fact, the food system is built entirely on their shoulders. So can we find ways to advance those stories? And I just was incredibly lucky to become friends with Douglas Gayton of the Lexicon of Sustainability. And Douglas is one of the most sophisticated storytellers in the food world that I know, and just has been really passionate about trying to tell the stories that need to be told. So Douglas and the work that we did in malts and elsewhere, part of what he told me and that he taught me was that there were two things. One is information waste. We have food waste and we have information waste. If I'm going to travel 6,000 miles to malts and use all that carbon, then I better not have any information waste. So when I get home, I should be able to tell that story by a book, by a website, by these information artworks, and doing pop-up shows, by doing public presentations, Zoom presentations. So no food waste, no information waste. And the other thing that he taught me was that we have to be platform agnostic. That is, that when we tell a story, to hit every audience, we need to be able to go into the streets with the public art that tells the story. We need to do it by the website. We need to be able to do it on the handies, on the mobile devices. We need to be able to put it into print. We need to be able to talk about it and just tell it and around the table. So those two pieces were really critical for me in trying to understand how we become better and how we really advance in this world of story wars. And the big marketplace, the corporate entities have done too good a job. And I'm tired of it, and we all should be, and we should all start to find ways to reclaim it. Tell the story of the future that we want. That's the critical piece.
100%. Also, if you bring back also what you said in the beginning, like not to forget the children, like everything around that. Where does the education start? Where is the demand of parents that require organic food for their kids in school? And everything of this is so natural, but how can we stop thinking in this and just allowing it to happen and again and again and again? So the information and transparency is just so important, and find like still though attractive ways and not pushing against, rather telling exactly as to say what we want in the future.
Right. And I think one of the challenges we face is that as we advance these stories, we're dealing with complexities that, the corporations and industries would rather we not deal with. The complexities of climate science, the complexities of human nutrition and human health, the complexities of ecological systems. So we have to find ways to be more effective in transmitting that complexity, without diminishing it. I mean, that's the really hard part, because it's not that you want to cover up the complexity, but you want to inform people about that complexity. And I think the medical community has really been complicit and therefore somewhat guilty in advancing much of what we're dealing with. In the United States, this is hard to believe, but in the United States, over 50% of the people now suffer from at least one chronic disease. And I think the figure is it's about 42% of all the people in the United States deal with at least 2 chronic diseases. And if we were able to find ways to tell those stories more effectively, and inevitably so many of those are coming from the food system and what we ingest, but they're also coming from the environmental factors and all the toxicity that we're putting out there. So the United States is an example of the necessity of the wake-up call. And then when you look at the insect populations, and Insect Armageddon, and a really fantastic study came out, I think 2 days ago, from is it Heinrich Boll Foundation there in Germany? It was called the Insect Atlas. And that atlas is beautiful and just came out. I would really recommend folks look at that, because here we're losing insect species, in some cases, up to 2/3 of the species in various parts of the world. So how can we tell these stories, but also leave some hope for our children? That's the real challenge, and not false hope. Yeah.
Exactly. But where, in your experience, in exactly this frame, where do you feel is the most resonance in people listening to these stories? Is it more the fear or these numbers, or is it more, where do we grab them in your experience?
Right. My friend Douglas Gayton talks about climate pornography, and that not being the way, for us to advance. That is the classic for him is the polar bear on the floating ice, going into the ocean. And yes, that's part of the story, but I think we have to find these stories of hope. I think we find those stories in many cases on the farms that we're talking about, that we care about. We're finding them when we take children out into the natural landscape. We're finding those stories of hope when we bring people together of different ethnic and racial backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and provide the opportunity for these discussions to be as rich as they are. So none of those stories are about false hope. They're about intentional hope. And I think it's that intent that we go into these conversations with that really offers the opportunity to see what's just beyond. And one of the things that always sticks with me, I guess 25, 30 years ago, I was doing a lot of study with and about the liberation theologians in Central America, and what the church was doing there. And one of the things that I was the most moved by, these priests who were working with the people who were so poor and had so few resources, was this notion that they put forward called aporia. So the Greek word meaning without a door. And that we have to understand, there may not seem to be a door. You may face this notion of aporia, but there's always this ability to find that door, or to make that door, and to get there. And so that's something that is really more spiritual. And I think it's one of the things that we don't tend to talk about, and obviously you all are, so I'm very appreciative, is how do we sustain ourselves in these, I don't really want to call them battles, because that creates an us and a them, but in these challenges, what do we have on the inside, the fortitude to move forward with a positive spirit? And I think that is one of the challenges. So for me, that idea of aporia is really important, that how do we get through this door? How do we open the door that we can't even see yet? And if nothing else, for our children, we have to hold that in our hearts.
Yeah, it's resonating a lot of conversations we have here, and actually, a lot of reasons why we decided to start this program, Lift Off. What you say about sharing hope is something that we were really keen on doing, because there is, I think we are all concerned by a lot of topics, but there is also so many things that are happening that are so inspirational, and that we can all start doing today. Also, what you say about this notion of finding the door is something that we remind ourselves often of. Guidance is internal, and it's a lot by looking inside of you where can be that door that often we can know how to do. Right. So one thing on that, in terms of sharing hopes, what we are always keen on seeing is like, what are some of the tools or like practical aspects that we could all start doing, like from tomorrow on, knowing or understanding the limitation of the current food system or the food production, and looking at how can we do better. You had shared with me, and I would love you to say them again, Philippe, the kind of like 3 tools or 3 things that everybody could start doing tomorrow when it comes to looking at the type of food that we have and how our soil are being done, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I may not remember exactly the 3 things we were talking about the other day, but I think one. But I see so much hope that's out there in various ways. One thing I would put forward: playfulness and play is such a critical piece. I think in terms of trying to find ways to celebrate what we have and celebrate what we want, and this notion of play, and trying to put that forward in our activism, so that the activism isn't always something that where things are rubbing against each other, but where we're advancing the cause and the imagination and putting that out there, putting that forward. That for me is a really critical piece. Certainly, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, re-inspiring cultures to embrace direct democracy. And this ability to pick up our own voices and insert that dialogue into the policy pieces that are moving forward. I think that's just such an important piece. And then, just as we were talking about, this notion of how do we hold it within ourselves, to maintain this positivity. I think one of the real challenges for us is, and it gets back to where we began with the discussion of semantics. It's so easy to use certain words. For example, we talked about moving from alternative agriculture to organic, to sustainable, to regenerative. But there are also words that we use that hurt other people sometimes when they're associated with it. And so I know when I use the words, for example, industrialized agriculture, I know people who practice what I would call industrialized agriculture. So when I use that term in a negative sense, it means I can never have the discussions with them in ways that I would like. So I think we need to think about how we talk about the other person, the other ideas, the other management practices, and see if we can lower that level a little bit of angst, and anger. And so I'm still challenged by how to talk about that other kind of agriculture that I don't like. But I don't like to put anybody in a box. I don't think there are a lot of farmers out there who are just these brutal, terrible people that I shouldn't have a conversation with. 99 out of 100 farmers I can have a really good conversation with at some point. So I hope we can remember that the labels matter. And I haven't figured that one out. So I welcome suggestions from other people as how we do that. But if we gather around the table, or, in the local pub, somewhere where we gather with food and conversation, there's a pretty good chance that the conversation is going to go reasonably well. So that's my hope anyway.
Yeah, which is what you had say, like conviviality, like going at the table, everybody around the farmstead, right? And like exactly. Just sharing stories and exchanging and confronting cultures, confronting in a good way, but just be ready to disagree, be ready to form your own opinion by actually having dialogues.
Exactly. The food represents the diversity that we can otherwise ignore if we're not careful. So often when that's there on our plate, either it's something that's common to all of us and brings us together, or it's something that's diverse and new and has other stories that can be told just around the food that's there in front of us. So I find that act of eating together to be one of the most positive things, which is all the more reason to do the work that you all are doing there. So which I just highly applaud. I think it's wonderful. So.
All in this together.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Philippe, for your time.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful talking to you. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Vielen herzlichen Dank und hoffe ich, dass einmal ich kann Michelberger besuchen.
Das habe ich auch, auf jeden Fall.
Yes. Do you want to show us around? Do you want to show us now a little bit the outside of your farm?
Yeah, we might be able to see just a little bit of it. Let's try here.
Yeah. Just to get some American mountain inspiration.
That's right. So here are the
wow. Wonderful
pastures, and so it is a
beautiful,
pretty incredible spot. So we feel really lucky, if you have to kind of live through and survive the coronavirus. This is a good place to do it.
That's the place to be. Well, I think, then it definitely sounds like a good field trip we could be doing. In the same, next time you happen to be in Europe, please visit us in Berlin. Would be more than happy to have you. And thank you again for sharing this hour with us.
Thank you all so much. You're always welcome to come here in Vermont and visit, and then maybe if we're lucky, we'll also meet in Malz sometime. So
Good.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen. Vielen Dank.